Welcome to Mrs. Feighery's video number 1 for the American Pageant, Chapter 31, American Life in the Roaring Twenties. After World War I, America turned inward, away from the world, and started a policy of isolationism. Americans denounced radical foreign ideas and un-American lifestyles. And as a result, the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920 occurred in the United States. And this resulted in Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who was nicknamed the Fighting Quaker, using a series of raids to round up and arrest about 6,000 suspected communists. In December of 1919, 249 alleged alien radicals were deported as a result. The Red Scare severely cut back free speech for a time in America, since the hysteria caused many people to want to eliminate any communists and their ideas. Some states made it illegal to merely advocate for the violent overthrow of government for social change. A lot of people who were involved in the labor movement are going to end up becoming victims of the Red Scare. In 1921, two immigrants, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were convicted of murdering a Massachusetts paymaster and his guard. The two accused were Italians. They were atheists, anarchists, and draft dodgers, and the courts were slightly prejudiced against them because they were also immigrants. During this time period, there was a great amount of anti-foreignism or nativism feelings among the Americans. Nativism, if you remember, was the idea that somehow Americans who were born in the United States were better than immigrants who came to the United States looking for a new life. Liberals and radicals rallied around the two men, but they were both eventually executed after a long trial. The new KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, was also an anti-foreign group, anti-Catholic, anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-pacifist, anti-communist, anti-internationalist, anti-revolutionist, anti-bootlegger, anti-gambling, anti-adultery, and anti-birth control movement. Basically, this new Ku Klux Klan was different from the old Ku Klux Klan because there was a wider scale of the people and races and cultures that they opposed or were trying to make feel not as good as them. More simply, it was pro-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant and anti-everything else, which was, of course, was different from the original Ku Klux Klan, which was specifically terrorizing African Americans who were newly freed men in the post-Civil War South. At its peak in the 1920s, it claimed 5 million members, mostly from the South, but it also featured a reign of hooded horror. The KKK employed the same tactics of fear, used lynchings and intimidation to be able to terrorize any of these groups. It was stopped not by the exposure of racism, but by money fraud, which was exposed later in the 1920s. In 1920 to 1921, some 800,000 European new immigrants, which they're called the new immigrants because they mostly came from southeastern European regions during this time period, were coming to the United States. Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act in 1921, in which newcomers from Europe were restricted at any year to a quota. And this was an attempt for the United States to prevent the huge wave of immigration that was coming into the United States after World War I. The quota for the Emergency Quota Act was originally set at 3% of the people of their nationality who lived in the U.S. in 1910. This policy still really favored the Slavs and other southeastern Europeans in comparison to some other groups. so a new policy was sought. A replacement law was found in the Immigration Act of 1924, which cut the quota down to 2%, and the origins base was shifted to that of 1890, when fewer Southeastern Europeans lived in America. So this, in fact, cut back on the amount of Southeastern Europeans that were being admitted into the United States. This change clearly had racial undertones beneath it. They wanted to keep new immigrants out and the old immigrants in. This act also slammed the door against Japanese immigrants almost completely. By 1931, for the first time in history, more people left America than came here. The immigrant tide was now cut off, but those that were in America were still struggling to adapt. Labor unions in particular had difficulty in organizing because of the differences in race, culture, and in nationality. And we'll discuss more about the impact of the immigration restrictions and connect them to the immigration issues that we're focusing on today in our classroom discussions. This is the works cited page. All images used in this presentation are from the public domain.